Okay. Not yet, but soon. Not yet, but shortly. As soon as it says that it's sharing. Oh, it says we're live. Hey, Dan. So we're live. We're streaming live. Sorry, everyone, for our temporary.
Says meeting now streaming live.
Yeah, we're streaming. We're streaming live. We have our temporary setbacks, but we're back. And as I like to say, or as I said, I think this is going to be the way that they exclude people in the future from everything. It's going to be it's not just hunger and jobs. It's also your bad internet service, right? Digital divide. This is the reality.
Yep. We're already being radiated with RF signal like crazy. There's times when I've wakened in the middle of the night and I hear that high pitch tone.
Yeah.
That you only hear when you're a kid and you have a bad fever.
Oh, yeah.
You remember?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden now I'm wide awake and I'm hearing that thing, and I'm in my eighth decade, as they like to say.
Eighth decade. Oh. Hey, look, I don't see you as old. I see you as entitled.
Yeah,
Yeah, you're not old, you're entitled. That's what I say.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that line in my show that comes up next Monday. Go to my website at amok.com and get the link and see my show.
Yeah,
I talk about all these
a few
things.
Hours.
And I talk about all
just a few hours. We're so excited.
I'm talking about all these things that we're talking about today. Look, I brought you in today, Dan, because Pearl Harbor Day is on Monday, which is the day of my show, which is why I was thinking about it. Pearl Harbor Day. What was it like for Filipino Americans before Pearl Harbor Day? Say between 1934, we know the Tidings-McDuffie Act made Filipinos all aliens again. So 34 to 41, it must not have been all that great for Filipinos, right?
Yeah, well, 35 was go back to the Philippines, 1935.
That was the self-deport, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there was an encouragement. I think it was either 3,500 or $5,000. That was a lot of money.
They paid you to go back.
But yes, but the interesting thing was that according to the older sources, now of course you could do contemporary research and maybe find a different result, but I don't think it would differ that much. But only about 5% of the Filipinos present in the U.S. ever took advantage of that offer.
Yeah, I mean, because it was seen as it was a shameful thing to go back and admit that you came all the way out here to the United States and you failed, or that you were forced to go back. So most people just, hunkered down, stuck their head in the sand and said, I'm here in America. They don't want me, but I'm going to be here anyway.
Well, a lot of the other guys, some of the other guys that know this history really well, said that the only people who would take advantage of that logically, and they felt that their research backs this up. And I'm talking about people like Fabros, Alex Fabros and Oscar Peñaranda and maybe Peter Bacho. But it's only the guys that were really successful. The people who had, not only been sending money back to the Philippines, 80, 90% of the Filipinos here were doing that. And they were sending back as much as 80% of what they were earning here on a monthly basis, millions of dollars in remittances per year from the Filipino, mostly men, who were here in the United States and some of its territories. People tend to forget that Alaska and Hawaii weren't added to the states list until 59, I guess.
60, yeah, 59, 60, yeah. But I mean, so for the most part, the people who did go back, it wasn't the successful people. It was.
Yeah, no, a lot of the successful did.
The successful people.
Yeah, they took advantage of it because they were done. They felt that now I could go back and live like a king. Live really well.
But then the poor people, like, well, I mean, they weren't poor they didn't have money. The laborers, the people like my dad, they stayed, they hung on because
Sure.
they weren't done. They weren't finished.
Well, yeah, they were going to be, they still clearly would earn more money being here than they would if they went back to the Philippines. And they were still sending money back to the Philippines. You know, both of my parents, on occasion, even I send money to the Philippines.
Yeah.
But both of my parents did it on a very regular basis when they felt that there was a strong need, like maybe a really bad flood, you know, the usual seasonal issues in the Philippines. I remember this huge landslide. First time I
Yeah.
ever heard that and heard stories about how a couple of thousand people could get
Yeah.
wiped out in one
Eh,
mudslide. You know,
well,
I
that,
was probably only about 2 or 3 years old.
well, that was always the appeal, to go back and send money for family. But when it was a broad thing like a disaster, right? Uh,
Uh-huh.
you know,
They sent it back for their families, but even if it was a disaster, they still sent it back for their families, rather than contributing to a general cause.
okay,
Um,
so Dan, the Filipinos between 34, 35 to 41, if you didn't go back, you were here, you had to keep your head low, you're an alien, you were discriminated against. It must not have been a great thing, right? To be Filipino between 35 and 41.
yeah, yeah, and I think one of the reasons that Carlos Bolosan's writing was heroified was because that was the way he depicted the experience.
Yeah.
Um, I had a little bit different perspective because I grew up around a large number of Manongs, some of whom had left family back in the Philippines. I didn't even know this. I didn't know that they had wives and children back in the Philippines
Oh, yeah.
until I went to the Philippines, and that was in 1965, and I saw uh, Manongs the same age or a little bit older than my father, who was born in 1908, right? And they had kids that were born before the Second World War.
Yeah.
So, some of those guys came a little bit later, like in the 30s, before the exclusion, and the attempt to send Filipinos back in 35. So, like you said, Tidings McDuffie, 34, Filipino exclusion, 35. And so it was a surprise to me. And one of the, I recall one of those Manos looking at me nervously as we were sitting down to dinner at his house, because he was worried that I was going to talk about how he had lived his life as a single man
Oh, so because
in
there are
San
people,
Francisco.
I know some people like that. I mean, we had my uncle had people staying, and he was another uncle who stayed in the extra room, and he always sent back money to the Philippines, but he lived life here as a single man. But
Yeah.
he wasn't single,
Yeah.
but he was single.
Yeah,
But
well, we kind of, when we say he was living life as a single man, that meant that bachelorhood was, let's say, a lot of the old timers who had gotten married didn't want to talk about it, and some didn't. Some stopped going to Kearny Street
yeah,
because, um,
well, so they had
the
families
post.
here too, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
uh, uh,
Let's just say that they were still sexually capable.
yeah. Well, all right. So this is a
So
kind
so
of
there was life was tough. They had to worry about racism, in your face racism, confrontational racism, but they made adjustments to that.
yeah,
Um, they, they 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 didn't complain much about it, at least around me. I mean, they confronted it. Some of them confronted it violently and ended up going to prison.
yeah,
And some found clever ways to fight back against racism. I heard a lot of stories about Manongs who had been in the food service industries, both in the military, for example, Navy, cooks, and valets, and also in the cities.
Yeah. Well,
The things they would do to people's food, when
oh,
they were treated in a racist fashion. And they
see,
were a lot of it
I,
was very entertaining. I find it very entertaining. I thought, yeah, well, but if Filipinos could do some of that stuff, we need to be really polite, to our food service people and to the cooks. And so I laugh every time I see some uh, person even in a small kind of mom and pop restaurant situation, complain vociferously about the food.
and then send it
Uh,
back to the kitchen.
oh yeah, oh yeah, and
Okay. All right. All
and so
right.
guys who had dads, especially who worked in the food industry, especially as cooks, kitchen people. We all kind of look at each other and kind of giggle because we say, "Yeah, I'm not
Hey,
so
look,
sure."
wait a minute. Yeah, and look, my father,
You're gonna
all
get
my
the
family.
special sauce. You're gonna get the special sauce.
Well, all my family was in the restaurant business, and my dad never told me about those stories.
Why
But
would he? You're straight, man. I hung around I hung around under the rummy tables.
yeah. All right. So look, let's get back to this between 35 and 41 before Pearl Harbor, because one of the things that got me thinking about this, we got Pearl Harbor Day coming up. I read from Don Mabalin's book, Little Manila's in the Heart, where we're
Yeah,
talking about,
that was one of the more painful realities
yeah.
that she did include there.
I
We used
mean,
to
one
have
of the
discussions about how much of the truth to tell, and that was one of the things that she decided that needed telling.
Well, I mean, what Dawn says in her book is that the Filipinos were as much in favor of going after the Japanese because
Yes,
after Pearl Harbor, 10 hours later, the Japanese attacked the Philippines,
yes,
and it began the occupation in the Philippines, and then, of course, Filipinos here as well as Filipinos there had this fervor, had this anti-Japanese fervor that was every bit as racist as what whites felt when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And
yeah. Except we can't call it racist technically, because we're all Asian.
well,
Uh,
that was the thing. I look with from my 21st century Asian American perspective, I always look back and said, "Oh, it's terrible." What happened to the Japanese and incarceration of the Japanese with 9066. But when you see how the Filipinos reacted
sure,
in that time in 41,
sure.
and this was
But
reviewed.
it wasn't all of the Filipinos. There was a tendency among some to act out. So it's just like now the racism, whoever commits it, right, in today's world, there's a large number of people who have racist attitudes. Okay,
Right.
then there is a smaller group of people that are very vehement about their racism. They're open about their expressions of racism. And then there are people who are actually willing to act on their racism. And I mean by verbal attack. And then there's the hopefully smaller group that are willing to act on their racism physically with actual physical assault and even killing violence,
And,
murderous violence. And
and
that's also true of the Filipino community at that time.
right.
Um, my father told me, I asked him when I was a little kid, I said, did you have to kill people in the war? And he looked at me and said, of course, yeah. I said, well, you guys always say that you were the mopping up operation, and you kind of defer to the people who were the beachhead operation, the initial attack, the initial assault. And then you describe the work that you did, and you make it sound as though you were just following up. But you know, when I see war films, it looked like the second wave was really heavily confrontational as well, and they had to worry about snipers and all the right, and booby traps, and all that. And he said, yes. So yes, of course I had to kill Japanese. I said, but we're taking your car to Mr. Yamato, you know, and he said, they're not the same people. He said, that is a, I said, yeah, but Uncle so and so talked about going to Japantown or going downtown where he knew that a Japanese guy was before they were all sent to the camps, and that they beat him up, or that I heard one guy brag that he killed one.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was true.
Well, this
But
is the thing, and Don's book points out that there was a whole movement up and down the West Coast among Filipinos and Filipino communities that was anti-Japanese,
yeah,
that they would take over businesses, they would move
yes,
out of Japanese businesses and rooming houses, and then they would boycott the Japanese, and this is all at the same time that you hear. I've heard stories about, well, there were Japanese and Filipinos who intermarried,
yes,
and they
yes,
they left the state. Alex Fabros shared with me headlines in the newspaper about Filipino Japanese families going to Iowa and being told to go home. They're not welcome. I mean, they went all across the country looking for refuge because they were trying to escape internment, trying to find a place in America to live, but they were together, Filipinos and Japanese. So that's a minority story. I would say a, maybe a slight majority of people were like the people we were talking about, who wore buttons that said, "I'm a Filipino," so that
that's right.
not to
Chinese did that similarly.
right, to not be
Mhm.
mistaken as Japanese, to say, "Hey, we're American, or we are loyal, and we're with we're with you guys in the fight." And so, I know that that was one of the things maybe I skipped over those portions in Dawn's book early, because, her book has been out for a few years. But when I was preparing for for Pearl Harbor in our discussion today, I said, wow, I didn't realize that Filipinos were they were kind of a strange kind of xenophobia, right? It's
Hmm. Hmm.
sort of an Asian xenophobia that I think few people really know and understand. And once they do, I mean, the way Don put it, said suddenly with Pearl Harbor, Filipinos and Chinese went from being demons and being discriminated against. Suddenly they were allies. Suddenly
Yes,
they were in the same fight, and
yes,
Japanese were excluded. And then that's really what you need to know about what happened Pearl Harbor Day and subsequent, that suddenly the world changed for Filipino Americans with the war and with Pearl Harbor. And ironically or oddly, it was better. They were treated better than they were
yes,
before Pearl Harbor.
yes. And I think some of the anti-Japanese, as you put it, racism, I call that, when we do that to each other internally, people who are anthropologically of the same race, I call it quasi-racism, because the level of vehemence, the expression of hatred, the dehumanization, it's all the same. I mean, it is as though we were of a different race, white or black or something else, and we were looking at the Japanese in that fashion. Um, I should also disclose that on my first trip to the Philippines, I have been told before that I look Japanese, and but it wasn't until maybe a couple of decades ago that I had Japanese students from Japan question why a Japanese man would have a Spanish last name. you know. And yeah, yeah. But on my first trip to the Philippines, when I was getting off the plane, this was in Cebu. They didn't have the tunnel ramp yet. It was stairs, right? And I heard somebody that was welcoming my mother, who had descended before me. Um, Sino ba ang hapon?
Well, yeah.
And and I looked around, and I thought, yeah, man, they're talking about me. And when my cousin that evening introduced me to his barcada, his peer group, they were all college guys, right? Attending CIT, the Cebu Institute of Technology. They're all engineering majors, and they said, parang hapon siya. So, and then when we took a trip to Hong Kong and then later to Tokyo, on the street, I was addressed as Japanese.
Wow.
People in Japan thought I was Japanese. So yeah, it's been interesting.
Well,
I did the DNA.
yeah, and then you
9.9% Japanese.
really.
It's one of the oldest elements in my DNA. It goes back more than 2,000 years.
Wow, that is funny because my kids, I didn't do it, but my kids have done the DNA thing.
Yeah.
I guess I don't really want to know the truth. I'm sort of like, but I want to insist on another. Maybe that's the Trumpiness in me or something.
Ew, no, don't say that.
But all right, but my daughter did it, and we have roots that go back to Madagascar.
Oh,
And there are some Nigerian roots
woo.
in my family. So
So which side showed that up? I mean, was
well,
it your dad's side or your mother's side? Or
must have been my dad's side because I don't know, because my mother was from Tondo in Manila, which was a magnet for everyone from
everybody. That's right. That's
that
right.
was, the poor went in Manila, but so my DNA goes back to, and this is the Asian part, Taiwan.
Yeah.
We got Taiwanese and as well as Nigerian with the Ilocos and some Visayan, not much, but mostly Ilocos. And that was my daughter's DNA.
Which service did they use?
I think she did 23andMe, I think.
Okay.
But the thing is, all right, that's the Filipino side of my daughter.
Right.
And my daughter has a white side, and that's all Scottish and Irish and English.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the American amalgam, right?
Yeah. When you see the Malagasy, the reference to Madagascar, though.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's ancient, right?
Yeah. Right.
It's completely in agreement with the seafaring capacity.
Oh yeah, right. We were on boats.
Yeah,
we were on boats, and that's how we just it's like taking the double-decker tourist bus.
You got to do this sometime. Check and see what the Malagasy fishermen use. Their native boats.
Mm.
And their fishing nets.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, check and see what they look like. And then tell me, how you feel about it. I'm not going to tell you any more than that, but I'm going to just say, check it out.
Check out.
And then get back to me, and we'll have another brief conversation on the first time that I got that connection. But anyway, so we're talking about 35 to 41. We're talking about Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and we're talking about the Filipino reaction
to
Japanese, and the acknowledgement that with the Japanese out of the way, because look, we weren't, I'm looking at this from as an Asian American 21st century thinking, there was no Asian American, there was no sense of Asian American then.
No.
The Asian American sensibility doesn't really come up until maybe 1980, maybe after, not even then. It was an academic and political term. Right, and the first time I heard it was when Helen Zia talks about Vincent Chin, right? I mean,
you're kidding.
That's
like 82.
I know, but the idea of an Asian American activism, right, comes up with the death of Vincent Chin, which is, like I said, the 80s. But before then, not even with civil rights, we don't even show up. And so here I am. I'm looking back as an Asian American, thinking, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and America is just using the J word, like the N word, like of course, we're demonizing those Japanese Americans.
Yep.
And I'm thinking, the Filipinos had to be in solidarity. No, not at all.
Not really.
Yeah.
No.
They weren't.
I should also mention that I found it interesting that even though members of both sides of my family, my father's side suffered torture and killing at the hands of Japanese soldiers, and my mother side also suffered torture and killing. It was her side of the family that had the long-lasting prejudice and quasi-racism against anything Japanese. You know, my mother would not buy anything Japanese, and when Japanese cars and stuff
Yeah.
started selling here, she absolutely said, I would never consider buying a Japanese car. And I
Yeah.
said, well, if you're going to stay away from Japanese products, it's too late for that. Because by the time she expressed that about cars, I said, half the stuff, the electronics that you have, the stereo and the inside of the cabinet. And she goes, but it all has American manufacturing names. And I said, yeah, they just put the label on it, but
Yeah,
it's
well,
made
look,
in Japan.
no different from my Jewish friends who who say, well, we're never buying a German made car, we're never buying BMW,
Yeah, yeah.
and we know, this is, we all had this kind of reaction. But now my mother, my father was not that way. My father lived in what is now known as Japantown, right?
Right,
During
right, right.
during the 40s and 50s. My father, maybe he got in and lived there in the 30s and 40s because that, Japantown in San Francisco was the Fillmore, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we all lived. We were all ghettoized in the Fillmore district, the western edition of San Francisco. But my my father never expressed any anti-Japanese sentiments, but my mother, just like your mom. And
Yep.
I have to imagine it's because my mother was in the Philippines during the occupation.
Yes.
She was my
So
mother.
was mine. Yeah.
Yeah, and my mother, if you were a woman in occupied Philippines during those 3 years with the Philippine puppet government, and the idea of the comfort women,
Oh
you
yeah.
hear about the comfort women with the Japanese and or
Yeah.
the Koreans and the Chinese, but the comfort women in the Philippines was a real thing. It just
Very
wasn't.
much so.
It's not widely known, but the comfort women were real. And my mom was in her 20s, and she never really told me the story of her fear, but I know, and I'm going to share this on Monday, of the story she told me. But I know that I've only just said, she hid under the sewing machines at her, at the place where she worked, at the tailoring shop where she worked. But the stories of Philippine women being kidnapped and being
Yeah.
taken to
Yeah.
serve as comfort women, it was real there. We just haven't heard of it to the degree that we should have, because some people say there was a complicity of the government even today in terms of trying to extract an apology. But if you're a woman of a certain age, and remember that, I know now why my mom would never join me for sushi in Japantown later in the 80s when I wanted to celebrate and take her out for a nice meal. And after I offered, let's go to Japantown. And she said, let's go to Blum's. I'll buy an let's have an ice cream sundae and some coffee crunch cake at Blum's on Market Street. And that's what we did.
Hmm.
She became a citizen finally after all those years
No, I
as a
can
card
I
holder.
can absolutely identify with that. Similar circumstance.
Yeah. So that was real. Should it surprise anyone? I mean, should it shock people to understand that reality existed between Asian Americans? How we were like, there was a pecking order. It wasn't just, the Japanese are out of the way. So now the Filipinos and the Chinese, they all were able to gain things that they never got between
At
19.
least, at least momentarily, yes.
Yeah.
At least momentarily, yes. But as when I was trying to get into a pickup baseball game or something like that in the park, the area that we had moved into was a working class single family home area in the Outer Mission, which is now very heavily Filipino, right? But um, back then, we were probably the fifth or sixth Asian family to live in that area. So when I went to the park and I tried to get into a pickup baseball game, I would always be last to be offered the bat. You know how you grip the bat and then you top the bat, the end of the bat. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you get to pick a side, or they get to pick you. I would get asked, "What side of the war did your father fight on?"
Really?
Yeah, yeah. And then I would get chinked all the time.
Yeah.
Kids, up in the trees, or kids playing on one of the baseball courts or tennis courts, or I get chinked all the time.
See, that's the thing. We were kind of Filipinos were kind of all-purpose Asian American, right?
Oh yeah.
They didn't really know the background. We looked, we looked Asian, Chinese. Our eyes are. I'm just squinting now because of the lights here, but but the eye thing, and then, but then they'd see our names. Oh, you're.
You have good eyes. You have good eyes, Emil, because you have a fold. You have the epithelial fold.
Do I have the fold? I didn't. Yeah, well, the thing is, then they'd see the Spanish name. They say, "Oh, you're Spanish. You're Spanish." No, that's the mark of colonization that I haven't been able to walk away. So,
well, there were some people who ID'd with that mark of colonization to be able, we all have our ideas about how we can survive a little bit more smoothly in American society. And there was a period when, even all the way up until college, and we're talking about the 60s, I knew Filipinos who were trying to pass for Mexican because they had Spanish last names.
Passing for Mexican. What they turned their lumpias into burritos? Is that what happened?
No, they just they would just say they were Mexican, or a lot of them were actually half Mexican, so that's fine.
Oh, that's true. I mean, in the Central Valley, when you intermarry with whites, it was sort of love the one you're with, and there was a lot of Filipino love spreading around.
Yeah.
Even with Japanese, as I pointed out earlier, which is the ironic thing.
Yeah, we had friends. The group that I hang out with, the larger social group, had friends who were half Japanese, and they actually were in the camps. The older members of the family, the older kids.
Yeah, well, see,
were in the camps, and their dads were in the Army and the Navy. Yeah. But when they were off on USO, they'd come for R&R. They had to go to the camps to see their families.
Oh yeah, see, that's the thing. Also, when you mention the camps, the internment camps, which really were incarcerate, and they were incarcerated in the camps.
They're prisons,
yeah, they were, and one would think that we would look back and say, yeah, we were against the camps. But there were some Filipinos, and Don's book pointed this out. There were some Filipinos who actually were for the incarceration because and this is what they said, and this is from some of Don's oral histories. People said that Japanese Americans would be saved. Because Filipinos were killing Japanese Americans. And Nelson, the guy who is an Asian American scholar out of the Stockton area, he confirmed that Filipinos killed Japanese Americans, or Japanese Americans died, during that time, before internment. And I what were your discussions with Dawn about revealing some of those things in her book when she
she had we all approach this, particularly people of the second, third, and fourth generations. She was trying to be as much a professional historian as possible. Okay, right. Which means tell it all, if you can.
Right.
But I needled her about some of the history that I knew, and needled her about whether or not that story should be told. Yeah. And she would usually scold me with, only the good stuff, Gonzo, only the good stuff. and I knew that she didn't really mean that, that she was going to tell some stories that were really important. And this was one of them. And I was actually surprised at the detail that she got into. I thought she could give it a passing treatment, but she got into detail, and she found people who were quite willing to validate, right?
Well,
And this is a lot of this is really truly oral history.
right.
Okay, so it had to come from people who were first actual participants or first uh, instance observers of what was going on. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think that was really important. Now,
Well,
now you should also
that's
understand that history departments are still very prejudiced against oral historical arguments. They still prefer documentary, right? Oh, well, you majored in history, right? Didn't you? In
yeah, yeah,
Harvard?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you know this stuff. I mean, so there's a strong prejudice against oral histories, but it's I think people have seen what the value is of oral histories, and they admit at this point, most history departments admit that oral histories can actually, even though they might be conflicting with very traditional points of view on the history that are supported by documentation, that sometimes they're very corrective.
Yeah.
Now Dawn met with resistance
Right.
in the first few years of her. She was still on tenure track. She had not yet been tenured at San Francisco State, and the resistance came from some professors that I thought were quite progressive.
Yeah. Well,
But
they're
they didn't want to recognize the Filipino role in the development of agricultural industry in California, and I found that absolutely blasphemous. You know,
well,
given everything that we know.
they're trying to preserve their bailiwick, and they see some new information, some new evidence. I mean, here's the thing about that division, that schism between the guys who are more traditional and the new voices and the new historians.
Hmm.
A lot of it has to do with you know these people. Uh, it has to do with this idea of rigor, right? It has
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
rigorous.
yeah.
If it's not rigorous, we cannot allow it because it will fall, it will implode, it is fake, it is not real. We need this idea of rigor because it's
Hmm.
rigor is hard, but rigor is not. I mean, and the memory is kind of soft, and the memory is not rigorous like a something hard, a piece of paper,
Hmm.
document,
Hmm.
scholarly footnoted, which is BS, right? Because
Right.
if you have
It's
someone who
it's
is,
just as bad. It's just as susceptible to bias.
yeah, and
Yeah.
also look, this is the thing about history. This is my idea of the of our National Historical Society Museum is it should be a place for stories, to people
Yes.
to share stories.
Yes.
We're not academics. We're a grassroots micro organization of Filipino Americans who tell the Filipino American story. And you don't have to be an academic to say it. The woman who talks about Filipinos killing Japanese and being armed with guns, she was not an academic. She was a witness.
Right.
She was
Exactly.
there. I mean, if you were there, well, that gives you your credibility. You're Filipino. You have these feelings. What did you see? What do you know? What were
Yeah.
you told by the people who saw?
Right.
If you're a son or a daughter, what did you see? And then tell your story at the museum. I mean, that's sort of my envision or my vision.
Well, we also have to be mature enough to accept the possibility of challenge. Okay, but it has to be fair-minded and, as you put it, rigorous in the sense of a level of investigative. How can we say investigative reliability? It has to be salient kinds of questioning and of method and so I'm fine with that. I'm fine with the informal kind of history and rendition of history, but as an academic, the first thing that I do is to see where it compares or contrasts with what is already accepted history. Now, when she came out with an earlier uh, book, I think there was a Stockton book. One of the uh, Stockton
Collection of
Filipinos, a
oral
Stockton
histories.
book, something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And it was before her big book came out. She asked me to introduce her to a presentation that would be made at ILWU Local 9, right in the city. And so I did that. And she was very popular. I mean, it was a hit. That was extremely well attended, but the majority of the people who attended were older.
Yeah.
And by older, I mean they looked at, they probably were retired ILWU workers, right? Stevedores, longshoremen, that kind of thing. But they were very interested in the history. And some, after Don and I had both said that the unions were white and racist and tried to exclude, Filipinos and other Asians,
Yeah.
but they were also among the earliest to accept, Asians as members of their union. And some actually apologized and said, "Gee, I really didn't know about the anti-Asian racism." So it was very successful.
Yeah.
And one of my colleagues from her history department was in that audience. And I'd known him ever since I was a student, since the late '60s. But the other member of her faculty who had criticized her by saying, there was no substantial contribution by Filipinos to agriculture. He was looking at the Chavez story, right? And discounting the value even of Filipinos to the formation of the UFW. So I was incredulous at that. And I had helped write a letter of recommendation for that guy. He wanted to make the hop to Stanford. And so I had written, many years earlier, a very favorable statement about his scholarship because he was thinking about, he applied, for a position at Stanford.
Well, he was taking a traditionalist view. Here's someone who's really doing some, it was original compared to the traditionalist because it challenged.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think also the methodology, her work is rooted in, well, a lot of the work of the traditionalists is rooted in the journalism, the ethnic journalism of the day.
Yes.
What did the paper say? So that a lot of my columns, and I've written my Asian American column, Emil Amok, for 25 years. First in Asian Week, and now at the Asian American Legal.
But you look so young, Emil.
I know. Hey, look, it's a secret. You got to see my show. I reveal my secret in my show.
Okay.
Monday on Pearl Harbor Day night. But the thing about it, I
Well,
wrote
it doesn't run when you perspire.
look, I'm gonna explain that your reference to Rudolph Giuliani. I have kicked him off the island. I have kicked him. He is a shame, tradition. Look, you got to see my show, and I'll explain. Anyway, I've written this column in Asian Week, and also now at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and now Asian Week, I understand, is trying to get the archive open up to the public, because what we discover is that the ethnic press is a source.
Yes, absolutely.
It wasn't a source.
And Asian Week was, as far as I was concerned, the best at the time.
At the time, yeah.
It was the best. I was really unhappy when they decided to shut that down,
Well, they could have kept going, but here's the thing. Now they're trying to get the archive up because the archive is of value, just like all my articles that when Asian Week shut down and Emil Amok had to figure out, well, where are we going to go amok? The Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund was there, and I've been writing for 10 years for them. But here's the thing: as a source, the ethnic media is valuable. It is I'm fond of saying every time I'm with you, it is the first draft of history. And
Yep.
we all
Yep.
know that history is always worth reading because you'll never know the new things you'll learn or
Yep.
the old beliefs that you'll have to revise. And when we talk about Pearl Harbor today, I mean, I must have just skipped over that chapter in Don's book because I was more interested in how many Filipinos were lynched and what was the, what was Filipino life there. And World War II for me, I always avoided the war because war, America wasn't even in World War II until the Pacific, right?
Hmm.
I mean,
Well, there were some volunteers, independent, but yeah,
I mean, it was,
they did not formally enter the war until quite late. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and most people don't realize that it was the Pacific that began the entree into Europe. I mean,
Yeah.
they were fighting World War II, prior to Pearl Harbor. It was the Germans and the Russians and the other European countries. The dictator Hitler was in charge, and the United States was standing by.
They wanted to stay out of it. Yep.
Yeah, and it was Pearl Harbor brought
It
us in,
was it was post Wilson, post World War One isolationism. Yeah.
and sort of like, oh yeah, Wilson, who is latter day racist, and now we
That's
know.
an interesting way of expressing that.
Well, he has everyone's, is being outed for their racist views now. I was reading something where Philip Johnson, the architect, had not, pro-Nazi views, and they're trying to erase him from, our cultural memory. And in some ways, I mean, heroes today, but you find out how racist they are. I mean, at some point, Trump will have a reckoning for among his 71 million supporters or 70 supporters.
74,
70.
74 million.
I don't mean to shortchange the man with short fingers. I don't mean to.
Yeah, you gotta.
But
Yeah,
I,
but
I mean, but the thing is, uh, my point about all this, I guess where we were talking about the news of the day,
yeah.
how important it is just to find out what really goes on and talk to the people who were there and talk to the journalists and the oral histories.
Well,
You
this
know,
part about Filipino attacks on Japanese at the time, it's not going to be in the news.
yeah,
And because it's criminal.
right.
Okay, and so they very rarely did they even report when one of the most common crimes committed by Filipinos on Filipinos was disreputable labor contractors,
Oh yeah,
taking their gang's money and splitting, going somewhere else, maybe trying to run another gang in a different part of the state. And they could do that. They could hop around and do that. And so they didn't get reported on as frequently. That was one. And one of the reasons people didn't want to report on them was because there were people who were hunting them down, and there was going to be, they were going to come to a violent end and then get buried somewhere out in the desert. And so people don't tell that story.
yeah.
It was a question as to whether or not the story of that Celine Pereñas,
Oh
Shimizu,
yeah,
has told, whether or not that should be told. How a young woman was buried alive.
yeah.
And
Well, it all should be told, right? It all should be told.
yeah, I
I mean,
yes,
these.
even I who subscribe to that position generally, and like I said, I used to needle Dawn about where's the edge, where do we stop, and even I will not tell some parts of the stories. Uh,
Really?
yeah, because they're criminal. Some of them are criminal. Um, the activity wasn't that bad, and so it was more like white collar crime, that kind of thing. And Don observed the same rule. I know of a couple of instances, that occurred in Stockton, where people committed misuse of funds, that kind of thing. It was very common. But she didn't write about it. And it was one of the things that I needled her about. I was just making fun of the fact she drew the line at that point. Well, I know of things that were done here in San Francisco that were very similar to that. Okay. And so I don't tell that story.
Well, a lot of it.
I might tell you privately, but I'm not going to tell that story.
From a journalistic standpoint, you want to be, you want to give the story, but there is a similar to the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that always is in the back of the mind when you say, why are you releasing this truth? And is it better to not have this truth revealed? Are we better off understanding this? The only reason why I think that it's better to understand that Filipinos were not just, giddy about Pearl Harbor in terms of what it meant for their prospects because the Japanese were out of the way and because they were anti-Japanese and they're pro-internment. I bring this up because we did not have a sense of an Asian America back then. And people need to understand that. All we had were individual Asian communities in America, and we all got picked on at different times, at different rates.
Yeah.
And we all were fighting for ourselves. And very rarely did we ever come together. So it is a kind of it's to come together now, or to have an umbrella known as Asian American, and then to grow it to Asian American Pacific Islander, or Asian America Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian. It just grows every few years as groups say, hey, recognize me, right? We're part of this too. And we need it. Look, the reason why we need the coalition is because there are only 4 million Filipinos, but we grow to 20 million plus if we include everybody. And that's power. Right. And, and now the South Asians, they tend to want to break away. South Asians and the East Asians.
A lot of groups, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but there have been, there have been other groups that got enough critical mass that they could stand apart from the Asian American banner.
Yeah.
And I think that South Koreans believed, that they could do that, and they acted independently for quite a while, and they were a smaller population than Filipinos.
I know. Hey, look, they're just one more boy band away from really from breaking free and saying.
I just had this conversation with with my younger son yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one boy band away, one more big Oscar-winning movie away from saying, "Hey, Asian Americans, we're the Koreans, man. We got we got Bim Bim Bop. We got it." And
didn't we share a Korean lunch a while back? Yeah, I think we did. Yeah.
I just know that I just saw something on Sirius has started a young Asian American channel, and it's mostly all Korean. They don't show. I mean, do they have Chinese people and Filipino people? I don't know. I think there's a lot of boy band stuff. I think there's a lot of the Korean.
You know what? They got better. The Koreans concentrated on the development of real strong video value. Their production value is really strong, and BTS they've actually been in it for like 10 years.
They
just started getting really popular within the last 4 years or so, but they've been in it for about 10 years. And there were some of the girl bands, that you see if you go to a sushi restaurant, right? They've been out there for that length of time as well. So
hey, what is it? Gangnam style? What is it?
Yeah, Gangnam.
Gunman, yeah.
Gunman,
yeah. That's that was like where and he was an older guy. He was an older guy. And now all the Korean comics like Ken Jeong, Korean, yeah. And I'm telling you, and he's sort of like the Korean. He's sort of like the Asian American culture point guard. He's everywhere now. And
I know. Damn. If he's not the host, he's on the panel, right?
Yeah, all he had to do is take his clothes off in those those movies,
Yeah.
And the hang look, I love Ken Jeong. He knows. I tweet him out all the time. I love Ken.
Well, the
But
dude has the additional credibility of being a doctor. He's a
there's
medical
no
doctor.
credibility being a doctor. That means that he's not, he can take your temperature. Okay, good, good. Once he makes you laugh and
Well, yeah,
bust
no.
gut.
I mean, it's hard to finish medical school and keep your
Look,
licensure up and all the
I
rest of it. And he
I
was a practicing surgeon. I mean,
I give him credit for that.
yeah.
I love Ken Jeong, and I think that
Obadala is a freaking lawyer.
Obadala, yeah, oh yeah,
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 the
Obadala, yeah,
Muslim comedian.
yeah,
And political commentator.
yeah. I've seen him, and a lot of them are, this is the thing. You got to have the pop culture uh, thing going if you want to be a serious guy. And every now and then Ken Jeong gets serious about. Although I haven't seen him talking about. Well, I guess I've seen him talking about the coronavirus and stuff like that. I mean, it's a serious thing now, and we should segue into the coronavirus because this is an historical moment. We talked about Pearl Harbor as a demarcation, and
Yeah,
here we
yeah,
are, December 7th, and we talked about the Filipino things that went on back then. But I think it's also important to talk about Pearl Harbor because Pearl Harbor was the start of America's involvement in the war. If you look at various stats, we have anywhere from 290,000 casualties to about 415,000 casualties, depending upon how you count, for all of World War II.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
we now have close to 290,000 coronavirus
That's
deaths
right.
right now.
That's right.
And we have a prediction of by April, 500,000
Yeah,
coronavirus deaths.
yeah. 400,000 by February, and a possibility 500,000 by March or April.
So this is an historic time for not just, well, for all of America, but for the Filipino American community too, because we're still front lines, we're still nurses, we're still out there fighting.
Yeah, I haven't been able to. Have you checked out the position that 40% of the nurses who have passed because of COVID that they contracted, on the job, that 40% of them are Filipino?
I didn't know if it was that high. I have not.
Yeah, and that's about a month old. That I saw that stat fly by, and it was a Filipino nurses organization that put that stat up, but I haven't seen a verifying or a validating, second position or perspective.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me. Zenny Cortez was the first Filipino American to head up the nurses union a while back, and she's still out there fighting. I don't think she's I don't think she's no longer president, but you know, I'm I'm I've been in my closet. I'm in my closet doing Zoom. This is how I connect with people. But I, you start seeing these numbers. And you start seeing these orders, right? We have 100,000 hospitalizations. The ICU beds have dropped down below the threshold here in my county, and in San Francisco, they're preemptive. So we're all under lockdown. I
Yeah,
just hope that people take heed and lock down for safety. But in this historic moment, I mean, it's an historic moment, Dan. There's no question about
yeah,
that.
yeah, absolutely.
Will we be looking back 5 years from now, 10 years saying, wow, what were you Filipinos doing? And
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You've got the Filipino Trumpers who are just as committed as the what people say is 25 to 30% of the voters who are Trump no matter what, and that's kind of scary.
yeah,
It's that means that the people are really rather irrational, you know. And I've seen critics of our own community talk about the irrationality of the Filipino mentality.
yeah,
Of course, we have the more formal discussion by social scientists, particularly psychologists, right, about colonial mentality and all that.
right,
And those are important contributions to trying to understand, right, the Filipino condition as it is, Filipino American condition, the Filipino British condition, right. But it's not it's not down on the ground. You know, I want to hear from clinicians that work with Filipinos that have psychological and psychiatric problems, and see how our understanding of colonial effect may contribute to the problems. I put an open question out in front of somebody on Facebook who's a well-known psychologist, and my question was, can colonial mentality, to what extent is colonial mentality uh, an element of Filipino resilience? You know, Filipino, we like to talk about how we survive stuff, and we're resilient even when under attack and pressure, even long term, and all that. And from my observation, right, simple observation of things going on in the community, particularly on a larger scale, observations about families, my own included, a more extended family, and part of the resilience is a way of looking at the world that shields them from a more complete and honest, for example, acceptance of historical fact, you know, about themselves, about Filipinos, right? Um, I remember a
Wait, wait,
well-known
so,
leading
hold on,
member
Dan. Hold on, Dan.
of,
So you say they're shielded. That
yeah,
means they don't believe, or
yeah,
they
they
believe in what
tend to, they just, it's not that they, yeah, if they hear it, that they don't believe it, or they don't deny it actively so much as they just pretend that it didn't happen. It's not there.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
They just
I know,
ignore it.
I know Filipino families like that.
Yeah, they just ignore it.
There's the truth, and you ignore it. It didn't happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the Filipino gaslight. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
PG&E, Filipino gaslight. That, that is that's what happens.
Yeah, you know, it's survival skill. Well, I've met families who say, yeah, you know, we teach our kids culture, you know, and they're really proud that the kids can speak Tagalog or Visayan, you know, Cebuano, whatever. And then and I say, well, what about you know, the history? And they go, oh no, that's not important. We're here now. So
Indigo
they don't
man.
want to talk about the history, you know, the colonial stuff, and you know, okay, the Americans did this decades long
Yeah.
uh, attack on Filipinos, you know, trying to colonize the country, right? And it went for longer than a decade, right? You know, so you know, it was murderous, and some people estimate that up to 1 million people were killed as a result, you know, and then you show them some of the proof, you know, Mark Twain's writings that
Yeah.
were in columns, you know, published all over the country, and particularly here in San Francisco, the Chronicle, the Examiner, etc. So so then they just say, oh, well, that's not important, you know, because we're here now. And so they want to teach them the culture and how to speak, and maybe keep the language and you know, the dance and all that together, but they don't want to know the history.
And that's because we're looking forward. We're looking forward. Get now. Get the degree, get the good job. Oh, you live
I got
in the heights.
the okay. Yeah, there's also, that's kind of a class biased rendition, but it's okay. You know, it's real. It's real.
Okay,
Uh, on
Sarah
the other
McLean.
end of class, there's a family very well known mestizo family. Uh, in fact, the dad was a well-known businessman, very successful,
Uh,
and he's also been on state commissions. He's been on local and state commissions. That's as far as I'll go, because you'll be able to figure out who it is, and then
okay, all right,
I'll
all
get
right,
a libel suit, you know. So,
all right, all right. So what happened?
but and let's say he was really well known, especially in San Francisco, and I remember riding in an elevator after a meeting, you know, of community leaders and stuff. I was there more as an observer than anything else, but I did participate mildly. And as we were riding down the elevator, uh, we were I mentioned something happening with the iHotel issue. The hotel had already been torn down. You know, this was past the early '80s, and the hotel had already been torn down. This was a period probably right around the time that Benigno Aquino was assassinated. Okay, so around that time. So when I mentioned the I Hotel, this gentleman who was trying to engage people in Filipino American political process, right, said, "Oh, you know, I don't understand why those people are so important to you. They're ne'er-do-wells." He used the word ne'er-do-wells, you know,
Ne'er-do-wells. That's a
and
very
that stuck in my head. The fact that he would use a term like that, which kind of is quasi Shakespearean, you know, but
it's a,
uh, it pissed me off,
it's
you
real
know.
Midwest. David Letterman used to use that all the time.
Yeah,
Oh, those ne'er-do-wells.
yeah,
As a joke, as an ironic joke, but
as a running joke, yeah.
it's a kind of, well, I don't know how ironic, but you are looking down your nose at those ne'er-do-wells.
Yeah, well, and that's the way people. That's what I teach in my class. I said, you know, everybody always acts as though the I Hotel was a big heroic issue, and you know, I said it was not popular in the Filipino American community. It was a pain to try and get people to pay attention to the issue, and even from a distance. You know, they didn't even want to be associated with it from a distance, right? And so
Because
I said there were
and
more people outside the Filipino community that supported the I Hotel than from the Filipino community. That's the
yeah,
truth.
it's because most of the Filipinos were like the Jeffersons. You know,
I don't know if they
they're
were that high up on the food chain, but they
they were
wanted
trying to
to.
move up. They were trying. They were
Yes,
aspirational,
yes, they were aspirational.
aspirational.
Absolutely.
And
There
if
you go. Much more
and,
accurate.
and if you're aspirational, those guys in the hotel, oh, history. Let's pass.
Yeah,
Pass. Oh,
yeah.
let's go. Yeah, let's go shopping. Yeah, I mean, look and look. My parents, that you were. It wasn't like, I don't want to say Darwin. I guess it was Darwinian in a way, you know. But you know, we weren't eating each other. But it was the communities. They had the Filipino Community Hall on Baker in California,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and you had your family, and that was it. And you had your mutual aid society. So when people died, you saw them,
Well,
and
The
usually with people.
veterans, post
Uh,
World War II veterans, also
oh
had
yeah,
very vibrant social connections, right? I mean, we went to Filipino veteran activities at least twice a year, if not three times a year. And it wasn't just because of the American holidays, right? Memorial Day, Veterans Day. It was also
all the
they
holidays.
had picnics, right, during the
Yeah.
summer, and they had holiday, you know, Christmas balls,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And it
And
was really cool because they got to use the what was called the War Memorial Building at the time. It's
oh
now,
yeah.
you know, the Veterans Memorial Building, but yeah.
See, this is the thing about World War II and the veterans and the importance of the veterans to the
Yeah.
Filipino community and the importance of, and you know, this program, we started off this pop-up talking about, I mean, the theme is Pearl Harbor and the beginning of World War II and some of the things that you find out if you dig deep into the history, like how Filipinos really reacted toward the Japanese
Yep.
Americans.
Yep.
But the importance of World War II is so vast in our community. It provided social life. It provided the wherewithal to bump people up who were able to join the war effort into the
It
middle class. And
it
except my,
caused it caused the formation of those families
yeah,
because
and right,
you got 8,000 plus Filipinos in just the army, right? In
yeah,
just the U.S. Army units, two battalions, right?
yeah,
Two regiments, which were larger than battalion size, you know, which is about 3,000 each, and then they meet their wives and the mothers of their children during the war, right? Uh,
yeah.
Most of them got married during or immediately after the war, and then immigrated to the U.S. And that was the beginning of the family-based Filipino American community. Before that, it was a bachelor society.
Right. The
So this is
Filipino
one of the
middle
biggest
class.
contributors, you know, to the formation of what we know as Filipino American society. And
And yeah,
and a lot of the dads stayed in the military.
yeah,
So they were lifers. And one of the reasons they were able to provide for larger families, you know, three, four, five kids, right, is because of the military. They could get prior to the formation of large scale chains like Safeway,
Yeah.
right? The discount that was available to them was at the Presidio and other bases, other military bases, because they could get stuff at the the commissary and the
Yeah.
post exchange.
Yeah. This is one of the things about, my dad, he didn't miss a boat in 1928, but, he wasn't able to, he didn't qualify for the military. He had asthma, he had other things going. And so our family missed out on the big boom. And it wasn't,
Yeah.
he took advantage of the baby boom. He got the baby boom. So
Oh, I
there
forgot
it
about
was.
VA benefits too. VA benefits, yeah.
The VA benefits and the mortgages and the housing
Yeah.
and that was,
Education.
and the education, that was a great thing.
Mhm.
And that really is a part of Filipino American history. And so go back
Absolutely.
to World War II, go back to Pearl Harbor, and it all comes together.
Yep.
The Filipino, and get this, 9066, the internment, Filipinos were against it, but guess what happened on the same day as 9066? They allowed the Filipinos to be part of the draft. They allowed, Roosevelt allowed, changed the laws so the Filipinos were allowed to form the first and second. And I think he came around at the same time that FDR asked the Filipinos to join the war effort
Yep.
in the Philippines.
Yep.
And that
Yeah. Filipinos had been excluded from joining the U.S. military up until that point. That's correct.
and the thing about that whole thing about 41 and Roosevelt saying join up and we'll give you citizenship if you're in the Philippines. We know now what happens when you give your loyalty and your you give everything up for the Philippines or for the United States. Here comes 1946 and the Rescission Act, and along with your loyalty comes ultimately betrayal.
Yep. December. Yeah. 1946.
And isn't it funny that Dawn in her book talks about her dad? Her grandfather was here, but her dad was still in the Philippines.
That's right.
Dad, Ernie, one of my good friends, the late Ernie Babalin. I knew him, when I was working in Stockton, for the record. And there he was, Ernie as a young man, telling me his story about being a guerrilla, fighting in the fields or fighting up in the mountains with his, little slingshot and his ragtag outfit. And then ultimately joining the USAFFE, and then
Yeah. It was
ultimately joining
Yusuf. Yeah.
and then joining the military, the actual U.S. Army there, and then coming here. So he was one of the lucky ones who had both sides of the experience,
Yeah.
guerrilla and also regular military. And Don was able to write about it and include him in his book, include it in her book rather.
Yeah. Really high achiever in terms of the fraternal organizations too.
Yeah,
I think he
the
was the 33rd in the GO in Gran Oriente.
he was one of those.
You know,
He was high up there in the. I
yeah,
remember
really,
going
really
to
great guy. Funny guy.
funny guy. I liked
Yeah.
Ernie a lot. So, Dan, we'll wrap up here. We want to thank people for tuning into this virtual museum pop up. The museum is closed again because of this, the virus. We had some comments in the chat box. Nikki Dutil Delute said she had a Japanese American boyfriend back in the 80s, and and uh, and her mom wouldn't talk to him.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
my mom had the same attitude about the Japanese. Sky Valentine said, my dad wasn't violent, but he had a gun in those days. He arrived in 1929. He was arrested for having it and had it taken away. He told us of competition for jobs during the Depression. My father didn't want to be around Japanese as his sister was lost as an MIA in World War II. See,
Wow.
there's a lot of that
Yeah.
kind of feeling. If you were in the Philippines during occupied Philippines, the Japanese occupation, and people don't understand that. They say,
Well, they're heavy. Their behavior was absolutely horrendous. It was, beyond inhumane. It was absolutely horrendous. You know, and there's been some books that have described that.
Yeah.
You know, my mother was really rather naive. I mean, she was evacuated from her home island, and then twice actually, because her home island was on one of the Camotes Islands, small island group, but it was close to Leyte. So she was evacuated to Leyte, but
Oh,
then when MacArthur was getting ready to land, the Japanese were starting to set up embattlements, and they were back into kidnapping women again. And so my mother was evacuated from Leyte to Bohol.
oh,
Uh,
behold. Oh,
yeah, they took her and her cousin south. But my mother, you know, never understood the precise reason that my grandfather and her older brother evacuated them, and that was to protect them from the possibility of being taken for
sex slave.
sex slaves.
Yeah. I mean, they
She
had
just
to
not,
figure,
she didn't. You know, I asked her directly, without trying to frame it as sex slaves, right, or comfort women, and she actually had no idea. She was really naive about it.
yeah. I have a, they were like, they had to be TNT for a reason, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a
Yeah.
different kind of TNT.
Yeah.
Hey, look, Monday on Pearl Harbor Day, I get into some of this in my one-man show. It's funny, but it's sad. I talk about history. It's at the Marsh. Go to my website at amok.com and get the link, um, or just look up Monday Night Marsh, and I do a show at 7:30. But Dan, thank you very much for being part of this. Always,
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Always an honor.
yeah, and really, we'll talk again soon. Um, Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941. It's an important day in Filipino history, Filipino
Well,
American
next year is
history.
actually obviously a very big year,
Yeah,
you know, so people are going to pay a lot of attention to it.
yeah, and I think it's, it's funny. It's taken all this time for me to understand the Filipino American reaction, and I point that out only because it is a point of our history, and I don't know, is it a shameful moment? Should there have been solidarity? Should there have been a, and there was for some, for many
For
there,
some, for
for who,
some, yes.
those who intermarried with the Japanese Filipinos,
Yeah.
there was, but there was still this competition, this Darwinian competition that unfortunately, you know,
Well, they were getting the news. They were, you know, there was a short period of time, right, where the horrors of the Japanese invasion were being handled in, you know, the journal, in the press.
right,
And so they were hearing that stuff. They were getting the radio messages and all that,
yeah,
uh, and telegraph. And
yeah,
so they, there's a reason that I think it's a very logical reaction.
yeah.
Um, you know,
It's
so
it's part of history. It's up to us later to sort of analyze and to kind of come up with some kind of narrative or some kind of not explanation, just an understanding, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah, and it was real. I mean, this is real. What was happening in the Philippines was real. Unlike a lot of people who are willing to use violence today and threats of violence, right? With they're ignorant, outright crapid, you know, crazy and stupid combined, right? But they're willing to do violence. They're willing to use verbal and political violence, right?
Yeah.
To stop people from voting, to stop votes from being counted. You know, that's really crazy, and
Hey,
that's not real. It's not even based on anything real. Okay, so you got to give the folks who did the wrong thing and went out and killed Japanese Americans, got to give them a little bit of a break. I mean, it's still wrong. Okay,
yep.
it was wrong-headed at the very least, and it was murderous and criminal, but it wasn't as crazy as what you're seeing right now.
Well, I guess. Right now, we just, well, let's see what happens. We'll talk about this. We got an inaugural coming up. We got a lot of stuff coming up, but you
Well,
know,
he becomes officially the president-elect, I think, on the 14th, right? That's when
right. That's when the elector.
electoral college, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, we have a lot to talk about in our history. And once again, Professor Dan Gonzales, San Francisco State University College of Ethnic Studies, Asian American Studies, Filipino American Studies. Thank you very much.
Well, you're getting really good at that now.
Well, I know all the schools now. I'm Emil Guillermo. This is the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum pop-up. I call it Fans of the FANHS Museum. So the acronym, because Filipinos love acronyms, is FOFMU. Friends
Yeah. Okay, be careful.
Fans of FANHS.
Careful. That probably has some sexual meaning in another language.
Yeah,
So
I don't know. So
Be
all
careful.
you FOFMUs out there,
Okay.
thank you very much for joining us, and have yourselves a great weekend. We will see you as my late friend. We talk about her a lot because she meant so much to the community. The late Professor Don Buhalano Mabalon, as she would say when she left, all her salutations ended the same way. Mahals and so